welcome to today's instructional video on progress monitoring to drive results while staying compliant. The Kentucky Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Early Learning would like to thank you for joining us. I am Ashley Cook with the Division of IDEA Implementation in Preschool, and let's get started. So, um, we're going to talk today about getting from compliance to results. So, starting with compliance, why do we worry about compliance? And the first reason, of course, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The IDEA sets forth the requirements for all states, and then within each state, we have developed our own regulations. In Kentucky, we have the Kentucky Administrative Regulations, um, or 707 KAR. And all of those lay out what is required for our districts. The districts report back to the state, and the state reports back to the federal government, and that's how we get all of our funding. So that's why the compliance piece is important. Um, when we look to results, though, the reasons why that is important is first, it's because it's why we do what we do. We became special education teachers because we wanted to support students who have disabilities with being successful in the general curriculum in school and then afterward. So that's the main reason that we want to drive results. We get some guidance through case law. One in particular I'd like to point out is Injure F versus Douglas County School District. This was from 2017, and it's really been a very important Supreme Court ruling to help inform states and districts of what results should look like for students. Um, Short background on Injure F. Injure was a student, I assume still is a student with autism, and he received his first IEP around the age of 3 or 4. Um, by third or fourth grade, the parents realized that he wasn't making much progress, and the IEP that the school district brought each year stayed pretty much the same. And so when this got to the Supreme Court, they ruled that the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstance. So it really sets it up that the making progress is a very important piece of an IEP for the student. So our main goal for this recording is just to walk through how the compliance pieces can and should be used to drive results for the student, and what are some things that can be done if you aren't seeing results. Um, I want to point out a couple of supporting documents that I use throughout this presentation. The first one is the guidance document for IEP development. It walks through every step of creating an IEP, and has a lot of really great examples. The other two pieces, the IEP and Lesson Plan Development Handbook and Specially Designed Instruction Guidance, both of those provide a lot of great information on specially designed instruction and how that can be implemented and how the ARC can decide on um, those instructions that the student needs. These documents can all be found on the KDE webpage under Exceptional Children, Special Education, Forms and Documents, and IEP Guidance and Documents. The website also has a search bar in the top right corner, which may be easier to type those titles in there and find them that way. A couple of other supports that you can use locally, you have your ARC chairperson within your building usually, so they're a great support when you have questions. Your director of special education for your district can also provide a lot of information and help you stay compliant and drive results. And then each area also has a regional cooperative, and they provide PDs and other supports for our districts. So all three of those resources are fantastic. A couple of online resources you may want to check out. The IRIS Center is through Vanderbilt. They provide modules and trainings. Some that I used for this presentation, the intensive interventions, parts 1 and 2, are very informative for how to implement interventions and how to know when it's appropriate to change those interventions. They also have a module called Progress Monitoring Math. It is geared toward math goals, but can be very easily adapted for any other content area. Um, and finally, the Progress Center. It is promotingprogress.org. They have a webinar called the IEP, What Every Educator Needs to Know to Promote Progress, and it goes a lot more in depth than I will about the IEP and how the creation of the IEP can help promote progress. So we're going to start by looking at the things that have to happen during the ARC. These four topics are obviously not the entire IEP, but they're really important for what happens for the progress monitoring outside of the ARC. So we'll first talk about present levels, your annual measurable goals, specially designed instruction, and your special education services. So as we all know, our present levels, they provide the ARC with a baseline of the student's strengths and needs. Um, all of the present levels need to be data driven and specific, um, including statements like struggles in math is not going to be specific enough or data driven enough to create and develop an appropriate program for that student. Um, so of course, the present levels are the foundation of the IEP. It's where you start to make all of your other decisions, including your measurable annual goals, your SDI, and your other supports and services to meet the student's needs. There should always be a direct relationship between the information in this section and the measurable annual goals. Um, if you have a goal and can't tie it back to your present levels, then the ARC needs to reconsider that goal because it may not be appropriate for the student, or you've left something out of the present levels. Um, and the present levels provide the baseline for which a student's progress will be measured. Having a data-driven baseline is what's going to set up your entire IEP and your progress monitoring to drive results for the student. Once you have established your present levels and your baselines, this is where we can start making those annual goals. Um, The measurable annual goals are just the statements of the results you expect to see in a calendar year or whenever the ARC determines that they should be achieved. Um, that's especially true for objectives and benchmarks. These goals are designed to meet the needs resulting from the student's disability in order to make progress in the general curriculum. Um, a really important factor is that the goal should be appropriately ambitious in light of the student's circumstances and consider the student's potential for growth. So we don't want to just always have a certain percentage point that we put on students' goals because that may not be the appropriate potential for that student. And we can see the measurable annual goals as bridging the gap from where the student is, their baseline, to where they need to be. And they can address academic and functional skills. Um, This is included in the guidance document for IEP development. Pages 40 to 43 really goes in depth on writing your annual goals. When we look at our annual goals, one of the main things to consider is what should the goal be? What percentage or at what rate should the student be able to perform that skill? So, of course, first thing to consider is the current level of performance. Um, Knowing exactly where the student is now helps you gauge how far they can get in the future. Also looking at the time frame. If it's the annual goal for the entire year, then that gives you a bit of time. If it's a shorter objective that you'd like to achieve faster, um, keeping that in mind about how much that student can grow in that amount of time. And another piece that you can look into is what would be the average rate of growth needed. So if we have a baseline and a goal, how much does that student have to grow in that in our amount of time we've set up? So you can actually calculate this. You just take your goal, subtract your baseline, and that tells you your gap. You would take your gap and divide it by the number of weeks you have available, and then that tells you the rate of growth per week. How many points does the student need to increase each week? Um, a concrete example for you would be if the goal for the student would be to get to 80% accuracy, and they're currently at 20%, we have a gap of 60. Um, we take our gap, our 60, divide it by 40. In this case, the average school year has 40 weeks in it. So that student would need to, on average, increase 1.5 points per week. So you can take that piece of information and the ARC can look at the child's circumstances and previous rates of growth to determine if that's appropriately ambitious. Um, Sometimes younger students can grow a little bit faster, but just knowing the entire ARC together has a good understanding of the student's growth growth rate. And so it's really important to have that conversation as a team so you get the full picture. Once you have your baseline and your goals, the specially designed instruction is what's necessary for the student to make progress toward that goal. Um, it's planned, designed, and initially delivered by a special education teacher or a speech language therapist if the student's category of disability is speech and language. And it's instruction that is required to a degree or at an intensity not available to all students. And it's what's required for the student to learn to use their assistive technology device, a material, a strategy, or a service. Um, and this decision for what the SDI is made by the entire ARC team. This is one of those places where your general education teacher can bring a lot of information to the table of, well, what's the general intensity that students are receiving other interventions in a class? If we don't have that information, how do you know it's an intensity not available to all students? The parent can also provide some really great information here about maybe some previous SDI that has been tried, learning preferences of the student. Um, every person in your ARC has valuable information to add, and this is one of those areas that making this decision should be done together so you get a great picture of the student and what's really going to help drive those results. Um, there is a section on this in the guidance document for IEP development, and then it is definitely further discussed in the IEP and lesson plan development handbook. And when the SDI guidance document does come out, that will have it will be a great resource because it does have some information for the ARC decision on SDI. The final decision that the ARC makes is the special education services. You cannot make the decision of how many minutes a student needs in any area until you know what the goal is and you know what the present levels are and you know the specially designed instruction that student's going to receive. So this really needs to be done. It's why it's at the very end of the IEP after you've made those decisions. So the ARC determines the frequency and duration of services, the service provider, and the location in which the services will be delivered, which also helps you determine the least restrictive environment of the student. Um, it's really important to note here that the special education services is an ARC decision. It should not be dictated by the school schedule or teacher convenience or prior existing grouping of students. It needs to be based on what that individual student needs in order to make progress toward their goals. So one example I want to touch on real quickly is if you have um, a student with a behavior disability or an on-task goal, and they are in a co-teaching English class in order to receive their specially designed instruction for that goal. That student may not need as intense of interventions as a student who's in that same co-teaching English class for a reading comprehension goal. So those two students likely won't need the same amount of minutes. So keep that in mind when you're determining your frequency and duration. What is the intervention that's to be delivered and how intense is it and how much time is it actually going to take to deliver that intervention? So just to recap our ARC considerations and decisions, our present levels lead to our annual goals, which lead to the SDI, which lead to the special education services. Our lighter blue boxes indicate the next things happen outside of the ARC. So outside of the ARC, our SDI is implemented and the progress monitoring cycle begins. And that continues until the next IEP review date, whether that is annually or earlier. So the four main things we're going to talk about for outside of the ARC that drive our results is going to be progress monitoring, analyzing data, adapting interventions, and progress monitoring. I'm sorry, progress reports. So progress monitoring, our compliance piece, comes from the IDEA, as you can expect. Um, and the IEDA just specifies that we have to include a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals we measured and when periodic reports on the progress the child is making toward meeting the annual goals will be provided. And of course, we know that's as progress reports in Kentucky. Um, the results piece of progress monitoring It allows us to continuously evaluate the student learning, monitor the effectiveness of instruction, and then make instructional changes to improve progress when needed. Just monitoring, just putting data on a graph doesn't drive results. And so while you might be compliant if you have a graph with student data on it, if you're not adapting the intervention or making appropriate changes for that student, then you're not meeting the appropriate progress portion of that student's IEP. So just a quick visual on the progress monitoring cycle. Of course, the first part happens inside of the ARC where SDI is selected. Um, Outside of the ARC, once the SDI is implemented, you monitor progress and collect your data. The data is analyzed, and then depending on the student's response, if they're responsive, then you continue with that same SDI and continue to monitor data and analyze again at a later date. If the student is non-responsive, then you need to look at adapting the intervention, monitoring progress, and analyzing data. And that cycle just continues until an ARC is needed or the annual review date comes up. So just touching one more time on the SEI selection, it of course is always a decision made as part of the admissions and release committee meeting process. Um, the ARC considers baseline data, the goal, and the intensity and type of intervention needed to reach the goal. And of course, definitely look over the IEP and lesson plan handbook and SEI guidance. And just remember that SEI is selected by the ARC team. The special education teacher may present some options, but it's going to be up to the team, including the parent and the general education teacher, to determine what is the appropriate SDI. And again, your general education teacher can provide that piece of here's what we do for general students. So you understand that you're not just doing the same thing that all students are receiving. Once you're implementing your SDI, you obviously need to be monitoring progress as well. So the first thing to do is make a plan, and you want to make sure you're measuring frequently and systematically. You don't want to only measure progress at teacher convenience. You want to avoid cherry picking, like the students' best times. When are they most on? You also obviously want to avoid the worst times. You want to try to figure out a schedule that is providing reliable data. For instance, a Friday afternoon, a student may just be ready to go home, so you may not be getting reliable results on what they're actually capable of. Figuring out a time that meets the student's needs and is done frequently and systematically. The next portion is ensuring appropriate data collection training. Um, Much of the time, the special education teacher will be the person who does collect the data. However, sometimes general education teachers help support, sometimes paraprofessionals do. So making sure they know how to record the data and exactly what they're looking for, especially with a behavior goal. Um, the behavior goals especially need to be very specific and know exactly what they're looking for and making sure it's not something that's open to interpretation. So saying student will interact appropriately with peers, the person monitoring that data may not know what appropriate is for that student. So it's really important to ensure appropriate training. And finally, you want to make sure you're using the annual performance criteria. Um, if the goal says 15 questions, then make sure the student's actually getting 15 questions when you're monitoring the progress. And the process for monitoring data is just create your graph, administer and score your probes or collect your behavior data, and then make sure all that gets graphed onto your graph. The guidance document for IEP development does have a list of what needs to be included on the graph, or if you're using something like the IC goal monitoring tool, the graph is going to include all of those required components. Most of the time, you may have to check a box or two to include a trend line or an aim line, but it's all right there for you. Um, the third step, and one of the most important steps for driving results, is analyzing your data. The first thing to consider is make sure you're giving the intervention time to work. Research shows that elementary students generally need 6 to 8 weeks to actually show a response to interventions. Middle and high school students may need a bit longer, so up to 12 weeks. Um, Keep in mind that if earlier than your 6 to 12 weeks, you know that intervention is not working for the student, it's okay to go ahead and adapt before that. We don't want to continue trying an intervention that we know for sure is not going to support the student in their progress for 12 weeks just because we started it. Um, so definitely use your knowledge of your students to determine if it is an appropriate intervention. Throughout the intervention, make sure you're collecting data. We don't want to get to the end and say, okay, here's your one test, show me what you know. Um, and finally, when you are going to analyze your data, use the 4 to 6 most recent data points. For the first few data points, it probably is not going to be a reflection of that intervention. It's just the learning process. So when we're analyzing data, um, a graph is going to be the best way to do that. Your data points are helpful, but there's a lot more you can analyze using a graph. So if we look at this first example, um, we can see we have our key over here in the corner. So the blue line is our data. We don't have any interventions on this graph yet, so there's no red vertical line. Our yellow is the trend line, and the green is the aim line. So we can see the student has started a bit below the aim line, but they are actually meeting up with the aim line at this point. And following our trend line, they're actually going to surpass the data, or I'm sorry, the aim line. So we would say that the student is being responsive to the intervention. At this point, we'd want to continue the intervention and keep progress monitoring. In another 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the age of your student or the responsiveness of your student, um, you need to analyze the data again to ensure they're still on track with their trend line and their aim line. If we look at this graph, I've intentionally left the aim line off of this graph to bring up a really important point about our aim lines. So this graph is definitely upward trending. The student started at this point, let's call it 40, and the student has made an upward trending graph, and they're almost at 50 at this point if we assume these are 5 points each. Um, so just looking at this graph, we may say, yes, this student is on track. Let's keep with this intervention. But if we look over with an aim line included, we can see that this student is actually performing decently below where the aim is, and looking at our trend, these lines look pretty parallel. So this student will not be able to achieve their annual goal given the current rate of improvement. So for this student, we would want to look at adapting the intervention. So including your aim line is going to be beneficial because it creates a visual of how the student should be progressing. Um, Sometimes you'll see that a little tiny increase is actually exactly where the student needs to be at that time. And you don't really see that as much if you don't have the aim line. It also makes it really easy to tell if the student is on track with the goal or behind the target. As we just saw, without an aim line, you might think that an upward trending graph is making progress and on track, and in reality, with the aim line where we want the student to be, it's not. Um, And when you're sharing this data, whether that be in the ARC or through progress reports, it allows all of the IEP team to very quickly see the progress, and that can help drive your future IEP related decisions. Um, Adding an aim line, if you're using a tool like the Infinite Campus Monitoring tool, it's really easy. It's just checking a box, including the dates for the beginning date and the ending date, and your baseline and your goal. If you're using something like Excel or Google Sheets, it's a little bit more complicated, um, and you'll likely need to just do a little bit of Googling to say like how to add an aim line to a graph. So um, shouldn't be too difficult to get the aim line added to your data. All right, so we're definitely going to go more into adapting intervention, but I just want to talk briefly about it now before we get really into detail. But of course, if you have a student who's non-responsive to the current intervention, you want to adapt the intervention. Um, when you do this, you want to ensure to include the intervention adaptation on the progress monitoring graph and include a note about it. But here's where you need to be really careful. that adapting an intervention and changing the SDI are not the same thing. A change in the SDI must always be an ARC decision. So that's why we're going to go a bit more in depth on what that can look like. Um, but just really be aware that changing an intervention and adapting an intervention are not quite the same thing. And to close out the progress monitoring cycle, you just repeat steps 2 to 4. Your collect your progress monitoring, analyze the data, and adapt if needed as often as is required throughout the IEP year. We're going to talk also briefly later about when to call an ARC early because of your progress monitoring. So I want to talk about staying compliant with your SDI. I know I've said it several times before, but specially designed instruction, your frequency, duration, location, and type must be decided by the ARC. However, the SDI can be adapted outside of the ARC, and I'm going to um, give you some examples about that in just a moment. But anytime the SDI is adapted, on your progress monitoring graph, you place a vertical line and you include a description of the change in your anecdotal notes. And both of those pieces are required um, as listed in the IEP guidance document. So we want to look at compliant changes, and we can think about um, our SDI and our special education services as quantitative and qualitative. Your quantitative is the amount of time or the location of the intervention. And those two pieces are always an ARC decision. So your special education services and your LRE always happen inside of an ARC. So an example would be if you want to increase the amount of time for the SDI, the ARC makes that decision. If you want to move the student from co-teaching to resource, that's an ARC decision. So don't ever touch the time or location of the interventions without an ARC to make that decision together. Um, your qualitative portion is the processing strategy or the delivery of the instruction, and that's really the SDI itself. And so an adaptation of that does not always require an ARC decision. The initial selection does require the ARC and should be made as a decision together. Um, but you can adapt in other ways outside of the ARC. So two short examples would be if you have a student with a writing um, intervention, if they are receiving direct instruction in the use of graphic organizers. An adaptation would be changing the style of graphic organizer. Um, Maybe the student is currently using a um, like a main idea web and you're not seeing results in their writing. So you might want to change to a more structured format that includes like main idea, supporting details, um, closing statement. So that is an adaptation of the SDI. Another example could be for an on-task goal. If the student's SDI in the IEP states explicit instruction and self-monitoring techniques, then adapting from one technique to another is okay to do outside of the ARC. So if you've been using a self-monitoring checklist with the student, you can adapt to a visual timer if the student's not making progress. Um, it's just really important here to be careful that the IEP was not more specific. If the IEP did state explicit instruction in self-monitoring checklist, then changing to a visual timer would be changing the SDI. So anytime you're in doubt, talk to your ARC chairperson or your director of special education and get their support. I promise they would rather have a brief conversation about adapting the SDI than to have to go through litigation if you've accidentally made a change that needed to be made within the ARC. Um, so this is not at all an exhaustive list. There are many types of specially designed instruction. Please don't feel limited to this list in any way, but I wanted to give a few more examples of what the specially designed instruction could be listed as, what the current intervention type strategy could be, and then what would be a potential adaptation. So the left column is all examples of SDI. The middle column would be what the teacher is currently doing, and then the right-hand column would be an appropriate adaptation if the SDI is stated just like it is here. So if you want to look more into this, feel free to pause the video at this point, um, and take a look at these examples. So when you do adapt your SDI, you want to include it on your graph. So this graph would be an example of um, this was throughout one intervention. The student was not making progress. So the red vertical line indicates that the intervention was changed. And then the graph continues, picks up on the same graph. And now we know that these data points, especially these 4 to 5 on this end, will show how the newest intervention is working. So and then you also want to include a note of how the SDI was changed. I personally would include what the SDI is as listed in the IEP and the adaptation that I made. Um, However, this piece isn't required, this part is. So an example here is if the SDI on the IEP is direct instruction and comprehension strategies, and adaptation would be direct instruction and paraphrasing. So maybe they were using summarizing before, and you're going to change to paraphrasing now. So the last piece of what happens outside of the ARC is using your data to report progress to the parents. And so, of course, the IDEA indicates that this is a requirement, um, and the Kentucky regulations tell us that it needs to be more than a statement indicating that the student is or is not making progress. So sending home a statement that says Ashley is on track to meet her goal is not sufficient in this case. So it should be an analysis of the student's progress, including their starting and ending data points, any instructional changes that occurred, which is what we just discussed, and the rationale for the changes should be included. And then if there is any significant decreases or increases in progress, you want to explain why that happened. Um, so the IEP guidance document gives some really great examples on what a student making progress, a student not making progress, um, and a significant change could look like in that wording. So it's a really great tool to use when um, learning to write your progress reports well. And progress reports really help the parents be involved, and that way when they come to the IEP meeting, they do know how the student has been doing throughout the year. So there are some times that you want to convene the ARC. Of course, at least annually, you need to have your ARC meeting. Um, On page 69 of the guidance document for IEP development, there is an end of the IEP cycle analysis that's to be included in your conference summary. Likely, your ARC chairperson takes care of this, but the data does come from the special education teacher and the progress monitoring, so that might be worth looking over. Um, Another time that you might want to convene the ARC is if after multiple adaptations, the student continues to not make progress using the current SDI. Um, so this would be like with those reading comprehension goals, if the SDI is comprehension strategies and you've tried summarizing and paraphrasing and a main idea web, you've tried several things and you're seeing no progress in the student or very minimal progress. Something about that student's individual education program isn't working for them. So the ARC needs to come back together and try to figure out what that is and make some changes. It's very important to note, if the student shows a non-response to multiple intervention adaptations, you you want to ensure that the intervention is being implemented with fidelity. So are you as a teacher following the proper procedures for that intervention? And if not, that might be something to correct first. You also want to consider the student piece of it. Is the student engaged in that intervention? Is there an issue with, if you are in a group, is there an issue with someone else in the group and maybe you need to rework your groups and see if it works then for the student? Or what is the student's attendance like? If the student is um, frequently absent from an intervention, we can't expect the intervention to work in the way it's intended. And um, in that case, the ARC may need to be called to discuss whether or not those attendance issues are part of the student's disability or how they can help remedy those issues. Um, Another time that the ARC may need to convene is if the student achieves the goal early or is well above the aim line. If that's the case, either the student's making more progress than the ARC intended, which is fantastic, but we want to ensure that we are still making goals that are appropriately ambitious for that student. So we don't want to be shooting short on what that student could be achieving. So, in summary, keep in mind the IEP is linear and each section supports the next. So at no point should parts of the IEP be completely determined before the ARC has met. Keep in mind that each section drives the next and that it is always an ARC decision on what each section should look like. Um, Progress monitoring and adapting interventions is cyclical. This is a process that continues to happen between IEPs and throughout the school year. Um, Really important, always use the SDI decided by the ARC. When in doubt, talk it out. Find somebody on your team who can help support you in determining if you are making an adaptation to the SDI or if with what you want to do would be changing the SDI. And remember, we cannot change the SDI outside of the ARC. And of course, know when an ARC is needed. Changing the SDI, if the student continues to not make progress, if the student meets their goals early, and of course, annually. So if you have any questions or would like to discuss anything further from this presentation, again, my name is Ashley Cook, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions or discuss any issues. So thank you so much for watching today, and I appreciate your time.